Welcome. Tonight I will tell you a quiet story about a young man who wanted to build his destiny, but first had to learn how to master the fire inside his own mind. Long ago, surrounded by deep green forests, there was a city called Oakhaven. It was a beautiful place, famous across the world for one thing: its master craftsmen and their magnificent clocks. If you walked down the old cobblestone streets of Oakhaven, you would not hear the wind or the birds. Instead, you would hear the steady, peaceful sound of thousands of clocks ticking together. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Every house and every shop was filled with the warm golden light of candles and the comforting smell of sweet oil, polished wood, and shining brass. In the center of this quiet city lived a young man named Elias. Elias had a rare gift. His hands were steady, his eyes were sharp, and he could build the most delicate, complicated clockwork the world had ever seen. People whispered that Elias did not just build clocks, he put a kind of magic into them. But despite his great talent, there was a hidden problem. While the city of Oakhaven was perfectly peaceful, the mind of Elias was never quiet. A hot, impatient energy always burned in his chest. On this particular morning, the sunlight shining through his workshop window looked completely normal. He sat at his heavy wooden desk, picking up his tools, ready to begin his work. But there was a strange, heavy feeling in the room today, a quiet warning in the air that no one else could feel. Elias did not know it yet, but before the sun went down, his entire life was going to change. The morning began like any other in the workshop. The smell of sweet oil and polished brass hung heavy in the warm air. Elias sat at his large wooden desk, his back straight and his eyes entirely focused. In his hands, he held a delicate silver pocket watch. It was a beautiful piece, covered in tiny, complex carvings of stars and moons. For a whole week, he had worked on this single watch, placing each tiny silver gear into its perfect position with total care. In the far corner of the room sat Master Orion, Elias's old teacher. Master Orion was a quiet, gentle man with silver hair and kind eyes. He rarely spoke, but he observed everything. He watched Elias work, quietly admiring the young man's incredible skill. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the other clocks and the gentle, careful scraping of Elias's fine metal tools. It was a picture of perfect, quiet concentration. Then, it happened. It was only a fraction of a second, but it changed the morning entirely. Elias was tightening the final smallest screw near the center of the watch. Suddenly, his tool slipped. It was a tiny movement, just a millimeter, but the sharp metal tool dragged across the polished silver face of the watch. It left a tiny scratch. It was so small that a normal person would never even notice it. But Elias noticed it. Instantly, the peaceful atmosphere in the room vanished. Elias stopped breathing. He stared at the tiny scratch, and a dark, heavy feeling began to rise in his stomach. His chest felt tight, as if a heavy stone was pressing down on his lungs. His face burned hot, and his hands began to shake slightly. He did not feel sad about the mistake. He felt a sudden, explosive wave of pure frustration. Instead of taking a deep breath, instead of calmly reaching for a polishing cloth to fix the scratch, Elias let the anger take complete control. He squeezed his eyes shut, grabbed the beautiful silver watch, and threw it violently across the room. With a sharp, ugly crack, the watch hit the stone wall. Delicate silver gears scattered across the wooden floor. The glass shattered into 100 broken pieces. A week of perfect work was destroyed in one single second of blind anger. Master Orion slowly closed his eyes, saying nothing. Elias stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the broken pieces on the floor. He thought his anger was just a sign of his deep passion for his art, but this dangerous fire was about to burn down his biggest dream. A few days later, a grand announcement echoed through the cobblestone streets of Oakhaven. The king's messengers stood in the city square, reading loudly from a golden scroll. The king was holding a royal exhibition. The winner of this great contest would become the royal master clockmaker, the highest honor in the kingdom. For Elias, this was not just a contest. It was his destiny. It was the dream he had chased since he was a little boy. Immediately, Elias decided to build a masterpiece. He called it the Clock of Dreams. It would not be made of normal brass or silver. Instead, he chose to use a rare, luminous blue glass that glowed softly in the dark. It was the most beautiful material in the world, but it was also the most fragile. It required absolute patience and a perfectly calm hand. Driven by his burning ambition, Elias stopped living a normal life. He locked the heavy wooden door of his shop. He worked day and night, refusing to rest. Dark circles grew under his tired eyes. He forgot to eat, living only on cold tea and nervous, frantic energy. His movements became fast and rushed. Master Orion stood in the doorway, watching the young man destroy his own health. "Elias," the old teacher said softly, his voice full of quiet warning, "you must pause. A rushed mind creates broken art. If you do not rest, your hands will forget their skill." But Elias was too proud and too impatient. "I have no time to pause," he snapped back, his voice tight with stress. "The king is waiting. My destiny is waiting. I must work faster." It was a terrible mistake. On the fifth night, the workshop was silent except for the fast, heavy ticking of clocks. Elias was cutting the final, largest piece of the glowing blue glass. He was completely exhausted, his muscles ached, and his vision was blurry. As he pressed the sharp tool against the delicate surface, his tired hand gave a sudden, uncontrollable shake. Crack. The sound was sharp and loud in the quiet room. A long, ugly line broke right through the center of the perfect blue glass. The masterpiece was ruined. The dark, heavy feeling returned to his chest. But this time, it was a violent storm. Elias roared in blind frustration. With both hands, he grabbed the edges of his heavy wooden workbench and violently flipped it over. Hundreds of tools crashed to the wooden floor. Metal gears bounced into the dark corners of the room. The beautiful blue glass shattered into 1,000 useless pieces. He sat on the floor among the broken pieces, breathing heavily, believing his destiny was gone forever. He was wrong. Elias sat on the cold floor of his ruined workshop. The silence in the room was heavier than ever. He hid his face in his hands, feeling completely defeated. His grand dream was broken, just like the blue glass scattered around him. He had nothing left. Then he heard the slow, quiet footsteps of Master Orion. The old teacher did not shout. He did not scold Elias for his childish anger. Instead, Master Orion walked to a small, hidden wooden box in the corner of the room. He opened it carefully and returned to Elias. In his old, wrinkled hands, he held a single, heavy, dark piece of metal. It did not shine like silver or gold. It looked rough and ordinary, but it felt strangely cold. "This," Master Orion said softly, "is star iron. It is the hardest and rarest metal in the world. It cannot be scratched by a slipped tool. It cannot be broken by a sudden moment of anger." Elias looked up, his tired eyes wide with a desperate hope. "Can I build my clock with this?" he asked, his voice shaking. "You can," the old master replied slowly, "but star iron cannot be shaped in a normal fire. It must be forged in extreme cold. You must take it to the top of the Silent Peak, the highest, most dangerous mountain above our city. There is an ancient stone forge there. You must build your clock in the freezing wind, and you cannot return to this city until it is finished." Master Orion leaned closer and looked deeply into Elias's eyes, delivering a solemn warning. "Listen to me carefully, Elias. The metal will not break. But if you cannot control your mind, you will." Elias knew this was his point of no return. It was his very last chance to reach his destiny. He stood up, his heart suddenly filled with a serious, quiet determination. Without wasting another minute, he packed a heavy leather bag. He put in his finest tools, his thickest woolen coats, and the dark, heavy piece of star iron. He walked to the entrance of his shop and opened the heavy wooden door. Instantly, the howling winter wind rushed inside, biting his skin with its extreme cold. Behind him was the warm golden safety of his shop and his ticking clocks. In front of him was the vast, dark, and freezing unknown of the wild mountain. He stepped outside into the snow. With a loud, final thud, the heavy wooden door closed behind him, locking him out of his old, comfortable life. As the warm lights of his city disappeared below him in the dark night, Elias realized that the mountain was not his true enemy. Elias climbed for 3 days. The mountain was entirely silent, except for the sound of his boots crunching in deep snow. Crunch, crunch. The cold was agonizing. It bit his face and froze his fingers. Every time he breathed out, he saw thick white clouds of cold breath in the icy air. The heavy leather bag filled with his tools and the dark star iron cut deeply into his tired shoulders. He was completely alone in the wild. On the afternoon of the second day, the path became steep and dangerous. Elias stopped near the edge of a cliff to check his direction. He pulled out his only paper map. He needed to find the hidden path to the ancient stone forge. Suddenly, a violent gust of winter wind swept across the mountain. It was so strong that it ripped the map right out of his freezing hands. Elias reached forward, but it was too late. He stood frozen, watching his map flying away in the wind, falling into a deep, dark valley below. It was gone forever. Instantly, his heart began to race. His hands tightened into hard fists. The familiar, blinding anger rushed up into his throat. His blood felt hot even in the freezing weather. He wanted to scream at the mountain. He wanted to throw his heavy bag over the edge. He wanted to give up, turn around, and destroy his dream, just like he had destroyed the silver watch. But then, an image flashed in his mind. He remembered the beautiful blue glass lying in 1,000 broken pieces on his workshop floor. He remembered the quiet, serious eyes of Master Orion. The metal will not break, but if you cannot control your mind, you will. Elias closed his eyes tightly. He stood perfectly still on the edge of the cliff. He forced his tight fists to open. Instead of reacting blindly, he forced himself to do the hardest thing in the world. He took one slow, heavy breath. He let the cold mountain air fill his lungs. Then he took a second breath. Then a third. Slowly, the dark, heavy feeling in his chest began to fade. The dangerous fire in his mind cooled down. He did not scream. He did not throw his bag. He opened his eyes, looked up at the snowy peak, and simply continued to walk. He realized he did not need a map to go up. By the evening of the third day, his boots finally stepped onto flat rock. He had reached the top. He had survived the climb, but the true test of his soul was waiting at the summit. At the very top of the silent peak, hidden behind a wall of dark ice, Elias found the ancient stone forge. It was a circle of heavy, black rocks covered in snow. His hands were shaking from the extreme cold, but he quickly built a fire. As the flames grew, they pushed back the biting wind. The soft crackle of flames was the only sound in the empty white world. Elias took a deep breath and placed the dark piece of star iron into the center of the heat. He waited until the dark metal began to glow. First, it turned a deep red, then a bright orange, and finally it burned with a blinding, bright white fire. It was ready. He pulled the glowing metal from the flames. He raised his heavy iron hammer and began to strike. He worked carefully, trying to shape the hard star iron into delicate, perfect gears for his masterpiece. For a while, his hands moved with pure magic. But the mountain air was too cold. Suddenly, before he could finish the most difficult gear, the blinding white heat vanished. The metal cooled too fast. In less than a second, it hardened completely in the wrong shape. The delicate gear was bent. It was a terrible mistake. Instantly, a wave of blind panic struck his chest. The old, familiar fire of extreme frustration exploded in his mind. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. His instinct screamed at him to react. He wanted to destroy everything. He gripped his heavy iron hammer with both hands and raised it high into the freezing air. He was ready to swing it down with all his strength, ready to smash the star iron, the stone forge, and his entire destiny into dust. The heavy iron hammer was trembling in the air. His muscles were tight, but then time seemed to slow down. Elias looked at the bent metal. He looked at his own shaking hands. A quiet, powerful thought spoke clearly in his mind. If I strike now, I break the clock. If I strike now, I break myself. Elias did not swing the hammer. He held the heavy weight in the air. For 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. He simply paused. He let the violent storm of anger roar inside him. But he did not let it control his hands. Slowly, very slowly, the burning feeling in his chest began to cool. With a deep, heavy sigh, Elias lowered his hammer. He did not throw it. He did not scream. Instead, he gently placed the hardened metal back into the soft crackle of flames. He sat down on the cold stone, watched the bright white fire, and calmly waited to try again. Weeks later, the heavy wooden doors of the Grand Royal Hall opened. The king's royal exhibition had finally begun. The vast room was filled with the richest nobles, the smartest judges, and the most talented craftsmen in the land. Hundreds of magnificent, complicated clocks ticked loudly in the warm, golden light of the hall. Then Elias walked into the room. The people of Oakhaven whispered as he passed. He looked different. His hands were covered in rough bandages from the cold mountain, and his face was tired, but his eyes were completely changed. The dark, impatient storm that used to burn in his eyes was gone. Instead, there was a deep, quiet peace. He carried a wooden box covered with a simple velvet cloth. He set it down on the king's table and stood perfectly still, waiting with a steady, calm heart. When it was his turn, Elias gently pulled the cloth away. A collective gasp echoed through the Grand Royal Hall. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever seen. The clock was made entirely of the dark, mysterious star iron. But it shined like polished silver. Its delicate gears moved with perfect, smooth magic. The king stepped forward, his eyes wide with wonder. He leaned in close to listen to the steady, comforting sound of its movement. Tick, tock, tick, tock. But suddenly, the ticking stopped. The entire crowd froze. For a moment, the room was filled with breathless panic. The other clockmakers whispered that Elias had failed. The masterpiece was broken, but Elias did not panic. He simply smiled a soft, peaceful smile. 1 second passed, 2 seconds, 3 seconds of perfect silence. Then, exactly on the 4th second, the clock smoothly began to tick again. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The king looked up, deeply confused but completely fascinated. "Master Elias," the king said softly, "your clock is beautiful, but why does it stop? Is it broken?" "No, your majesty," Elias replied, his voice calm and clear. "It is not broken. I call it the clock of the pause. Every minute it stops ticking for exactly 3 seconds. It is a reminder. When life becomes too fast, when anger or fear tries to control your mind, you must look at the clock. It stops to remind you to take a breath before you make a choice. It reminds you that you are the master of your own mind." The Grand Royal Hall fell completely silent. The king stared at the shining silver clock, deeply moved by the profound wisdom of the young man. He realized that Elias had built something far more valuable than a machine that tells time. He had built a tool for peace. With a warm, respectful smile, the king placed his hand on Elias's shoulder. "Today, you have given us a great gift," the king announced loudly. "I name you the Royal Master Clockmaker of Oakhaven." Elias bowed his head. He had finally reached his great destiny, not because he never made a mistake, but because he had finally learned how to pause. Now, let us look back at the story of the angry clockmaker from above. Take a deep breath, relax, and listen to his journey one more time, simply and slowly. In the quiet city of Oakhaven, there lived a young man named Elias. Elias was a very talented clockmaker. He made the most beautiful clocks in the world. His hands were clever and his city was always peaceful. Everywhere you went, you could hear the soft, calm ticking of clocks. But Elias had a very big problem. His mind was not peaceful. He was very impatient. When he made a small mistake, he got very angry. He did not stop to think. He did not breathe. He just reacted. He threw his tools and destroyed his own beautiful work. His anger was a dangerous fire, and it controlled his life. One day the king asked for a master clock. Elias wanted to win. It was his biggest dream. But his anger made him rush, and he broke his work again. To save his dream, he had to leave his warm city. He had to travel to a cold, dangerous mountain to find a special hard metal. The journey was very difficult. The cold wind blew hard, and he was completely alone. On the top of the cold mountain, Elias tried to make his clock. But he made another mistake. The metal bent the wrong way. The old anger came back. It burned in his chest. He lifted his heavy hammer. He wanted to break the metal. He wanted to scream. But this time, something changed. He did not hit the metal. He stopped. He paused. He took a deep breath, and he put the heavy hammer down. He finally controlled his anger. Elias finished his work. He traveled back down the mountain. He walked into the king's grand hall. He was not an angry young man anymore. He was a calm, peaceful master. He showed the king his shining silver clock. The clock was very special. It did not just tick like a normal clock. Every minute, the ticking stopped. It stopped for exactly 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. The people in the hall thought the clock was broken, but Elias smiled. He told the king that the quiet clock was not broken. The clock stopped to teach people a lesson. It stopped to remind them to breathe. It reminded them to pause before they get angry. The king loved the quiet clock. Because Elias learned to pause, he finally won his great dream. I am an old man now. When I sit in my quiet workshop and look at my hands, I see the deep scars from a long life of building clocks. But the deepest scars I carry are not on my hands. They were in my mind. When I was a young man, I thought my anger made me strong. I thought the hot fire in my chest was my passion. I was wrong. I still remember the exact day I broke the beautiful silver watch. I was working so carefully, but my tool slipped and made a tiny scratch. I did not feel sad. I felt a sudden, explosive frustration. My chest felt tight, and my blood ran hot. I wanted everything to be perfect immediately. So, I vehemently threw the watch against the stone wall. I stood there, breathing heavily, and watched a week of my life shatter into useless pieces on the floor. Because I could not control my feelings, I almost lost my destiny. That is why my wise teacher sent me to the silent peak. I will never forget the freezing wind on that mountain. My shoulders ached from the heavy leather bag, and the cold bit my face. I remember the exact moment the wind stole my only map. I watched it fly away into the dark valley below. Instantly, I felt the old anger rising in my throat. I wanted to scream at the sky. I wanted to throw my bag over the edge and completely give up, but I forced myself to keep walking. The true test, however, was at the ancient stone forge. I heated the dark star iron in the bright white fire. When the metal cooled too fast and bent the wrong way, a blind panic struck my heart. I raised my heavy iron hammer high into the freezing air. I wanted to smash the metal. I wanted to destroy it all. But then, I looked at my shaking hands. I realized that if I hit the metal, I was truly breaking myself. So, I forced myself to stop. I held the heavy hammer in the air. I closed my eyes and I just breathed. For 3 long seconds I paused. Looking back, that quiet pause was the hardest thing I ever built in my entire life. It was harder than any clock and harder than climbing any mountain. But it was that single silent pause that saved my dream and finally gave my heart peace.